With that, we bring in Marc Caputo, the best-sourced reporter covering the Trump White House. I knew I could get him to smile with that. Many scoops of Marc's in Axios appear daily. Marc, take us inside the White House. What is the calculus right now for the president and his team?
Well, the calculus for the president and the calculus for his team are separate things. The calculus for the team is to give the president options to make a decision. The calculus for the president is to make a decision when an opportunity presents itself. The problem, as you laid out, is that there aren't many opportunities that are presenting themselves that are positive. So Trump, in some respects, in many respects, is sort of stuck between not great options.
Is he feeling that? Does that mean the team's coming up with different options?
They're not admitting he's feeling that, but he's showing he's feeling that by giving that speech last night, which didn't say a whole hell of a lot, but wasn't necessarily very well delivered. And to the degree that he cares about the markets, sure as hell backfired. The price of crude shot way up, and it spooked the markets. And it did little to give a lot of people a sense of confidence. So in that respect, he didn't deliver on what some had hoped he would deliver on. But Donald Trump believes that he alone can fix it, and he is his best spokesperson. And so he wanted to give a primetime speech because, well, he wanted to give it, and the networks were willing to cover it live. And so he gave it. But what we're being told is that the president feels very good about the military, tactical, battlefield, and operational successes. However, when you zoom out, as you just did there, and talked about sort of the broader political and strategic picture, it doesn't look like much of a win. And his body language, outside of what he's telling other people and like, hey, isn't this great, and we're winning and we're destroying everything, doesn't communicate someone who's very positive. What does he do the day after? He dismisses his attorney general. Then there's word coming out that he might get rid of his director of national intelligence. This is not the body language of a president who feels secure in where he is. And then he's been doing all of this sort of going back and forth and saying, oh, well, I'm going to bomb heavily. I'm not going to bomb heavily. I'm going to give them a deadline. I'm going to wreck their electrical grid. I'm not going to do that. It's been all over the map. Some of that is lack of impulse control and just Donald Trump who says what comes into his head. Some of that is strategic, that he wants to wear his opponent down and create strategic ambiguity. But in the end, it doesn't give him positive options.
As you're reporting out this story, and we both, I think, have fairly sort of broad sources when it comes to this, are there any red lines that you've been able to detect for President Trump vis-a-vis Iran, or is it all situational?
I'm unaware of those red lines. I mean, we could sit here and kind of come up with what those would be. But for Trump, he doesn't want to attack desalination plants and fully wage a sort of war of no consequence. That is, though the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, has talked about no quarter, which kind of means killing hostages. Trump is not there yet. I don't think he's going to be there. However, he signaled pretty clearly yesterday that on the target list is a lot of the electrical infrastructure, which could be interpreted by some as being a war crime. Now, his administration is telling me to the degree he is going to be attacking, or the United States is going to be attacking, the electrical grid and sort of commercial related infrastructure, it's going to be targeting those things that are controlled by the IRGC, which is sort of the military industrial complex.
Right. Well,
not
taking away
civilians.
Right. Taking away the power grid, if they're using it for their military ends, which they would be, that is a legitimate target. There's an interesting point here, because we had on last night an Iranian dissident who had spent a couple of years in Evin prison, the Iranian torture facility, for trying to overturn the government of Iran in the 2009 Green protests, and then listened to the speech and joined us afterwards. Take a listen.
Well, first of all, I want to say that some of the rhetoric that was used by President Trump in the speech is extremely worrying, and it's not something that I want to hear from my president as an American president. Bombing Iran back to the Stone Age will be, even as a threat, will be heard by the majority of Iranians as something that is not attacking the regime, but is attacking the people.
Where has President Trump changed in his thinking from 33 days ago, when right after the bombing began, he talked about there will be a moment for the Iranian people. I believe in the Iranian people, to now just kind of, we're done with them. We're, big hand and just wipe it off.
There's a saying in military circles about the need to keep the objective in perspective. And to a degree, he's lost that perspective, because he began this suggesting there would be a war of liberation. And now it's a war of bombing people back to the Stone Age. Now, what's born of that, or what bore that, is the fact that Trump is frustrated. He is winning the war tactically. The military successes, the objectives are being attained. Now, some of those objectives have now changed with the Strait of Hormuz. That wasn't an initial thing. Strait of Hormuz closed because he launched the attack. But what's happened for Trump is he's realized, like, he's winning on the battlefield, but he's losing sort of this broader strategic picture. And that's because Iran is not feeling as if it's losing the war. And so part of what's motivating him is to want to cause more pain in the hopes that it brings the Iranians to the table. And most of the experts, including the intelligence community, is assessing that that's not a realistic goal.
Yeah, well, the Shia religion mixed with the Marxist religion sort of views the suffering as the righteous, and therefore they can suffer for as long as they need to. We'll have more on that in more notes tomorrow. But there is a domestic political calculation here, right? Time stops for no man, nor do elections in America. That's a good thing. Come November, we have the midterms. But also, President Trump only has a little more than 2 years left in his presidency. There is a legacy question here. And there is a lot of commentators on the right who are now abandoning President Trump, chief among them, Tucker Carlson.
Well, that abandonment happened.
So Iran is not a military power fundamentally. Iran is an economic power. And previous leaders have understood that. Our current leadership doesn't really seem to understand that, or has not said that in public. But Iran's power derives from its ability to shut down, or at least gravely damage, the global economy. So the only question that matters long term is who reopens that strait.
Carlson may not be wrong about that. Trump also, though, sent out this Truth Social today, sending an article that was a massive takedown of Tucker Carlson, basically said, all right, it's war between the two of us. Does that concern the president? Is this now he has to double down on Iran to prove for his legacy that it was worth it?
He believes it's worth it. And to quote a famous former strongman, he does believe history is going to absolve him. I do question the way Tucker Carlson is presenting this, because Iran's power is that it is a state sponsor of terror. And what they are doing is waging a global war of economic terror. Now, I'm not I'm not an expert in religion here. I don't think Shia Islam has a sole claim to fame or revolves solely around suffering. For we Christians, we have Christ on the cross. The idea of identifying with suffering and enduring is a long time.
But Christians aren't really into the martyrdom thing, though, at least modern Christianity, I guess.
Yeah, well, that is true. However, almost every country that I'm aware of that's ever been invaded usually fights the invaders tooth and nail. And that's the situation the Iranians are in. They're in a war of survival. The regime is in a war of survival. The United States is in a war of choice. And one of the things that's very difficult to quantify, even if you tally up all the bombs and the missiles and you have all of the microchips in the world, is understanding the depth of human spirit and the ability to resist. And right now, that advantage, the ability to resist in the spirit and fighting the invader, is with the Iranians and not the United States or Israel.
100%. The war of political will is a major factor on this battlefield. Marc Caputo, excellent thoughts. Little theology here. When you got at 9 p.m. Eastern, we appreciate you, my friend. Good to see you.
A little bit of both. Thank you, man.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.